Well, hey, everybody, and thanks again for joining us this Memorial Day weekend here at Eaglebrook Church in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. It thrills my heart that you're watching today since we're still doing our teachings here by way of video. So again, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we are living in a time where our world is still wrestling. And they're wrestling with how to live in the midst of a global pandemic at whatever stage this might be in right now, whether it's the beginning, the middle, or the end, we don't know. Or how to live as states and certain counties begin to relax restrictions and they begin to open up again. Or how to live when there's such strong opinions on either side. Because for the Christian, for the follower of Jesus, it should not matter. And let me tell you why. Folks, whether we are able to gather again soon here in the same physical space, or we cannot due to certain restrictions, or if our gatherings look completely different for a while, if and when we start meeting again, but due to certain guidelines. Folks, regardless of any external circumstances, again, the church is not a building. The church is the people. And how we live as the body of Christ should look the same, no matter what. Which is why over a month ago, God led me to start teaching from Paul's letter to the Romans, starting in chapter 12, and we are now in chapter 13. So I want to retrace some of the main themes that we've covered, if nothing more than just to remind us again how to live during any time or season, but especially during these times. So here's what we've been studying. Let's be patient. Be a blessing. As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And live well under authority. Today, we look at the heart beneath all of that, which makes that kind of life possible. So I want to set this up today by asking you this question. All right, how many of you have ever used this phrase or thought this phrase or at least know about this phrase? And that phrase is, I owe, so off to work I go. All right? I mean, that's so true, right? I mean, we owe because most of us are in some form of debt. I mean, student loans or car payments or mortgages or medical bills or credit cards. We even hear about the national debt. There's all kinds of debt. And we can go on and on from there. But a debt is something, usually money, that is owed or due. It is an obligation that must be paid on a regular basis until the amount is paid off. So, let me ask you this. How many of you want to be in debt for the rest of your life? Now, probably right now, most of you are not raising your hands. So let me ask you another question then. How many of you are looking forward to the day, and you hope it's within your lifetime, when you will be out of debt and you'll be debt-free? All right? That's me. Now, most of you probably right there are raising your hands. So, I mean, paying off debts is quite often, it's grueling, it's painful, we want it to end, and then we celebrate when those debts do end. We hear about people burning their mortgages. We celebrate because those debts are no longer outstanding. Because we like it when we no longer owe anybody anything. Money, a favor, whatever. There is something inside all of us that just wants to be free from debt. However, what if I told you that there is one debt that the Apostle Paul says that we are never to pay off? A debt that always remains outstanding. It is the only debt, really, that's endorsed in the Scriptures. A debt that would actually be a timely thing given the conditions of our world today. So look here. Paul says this. Do not owe people anything, and let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. Always owe love to each other, because the person who loves others has obeyed or fulfilled all the law. Now, that should give us all pause to think. You see, in other words, we all have a limitless debt that we are never supposed to be done paying off. The debt of godly love toward others. And this kind of love is supposed to look a certain way, but also not look a certain way, as the case may be, which is exactly where Paul goes. So look here. He writes, the law says you must not be guilty of adultery, you must not murder anyone, you must not steal, and you must not take your neighbor's things. So here Paul lists 4 out of the top 10, right? 4 out of the 10 commandments that we find in Exodus chapter 20. The 10 commandments, if you recall, were divided into 2 parts. Our responsibility toward God, which is commandments 1 and 2, and our responsibility toward each other, commandments 3 through 10. Now, our responsibility toward God can be summarized this way, that we are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, your mind, all your strength. And our responsibility toward each other is an extension of that, to love your neighbor as yourself. And right here, Paul is just dealing with the responsibility we have toward one another, or commandments 3 through 10. But you would expect him to be consistent not only with the law of Moses, but also with Jesus, both of whom we just quoted. And Paul is. Look here. The next verse, or the last half of verse 9 says, all these commands and all others are really only one rule. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Same language. So Paul is connecting the dots here, that the command to love your neighbor is the debt that we are to continue to owe. And it creates then this foundation, the what, if you will, that our lives are based on. And that what is this? And it's our first point, number 1. I owe you love. By extension, you owe me love. We collectively owe this world love. Now, so often, we look at people, and our first reaction was, man, I don't owe them or them or them or them anything. Honor, respect, gratitude, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, a moral life, anything. I don't owe them anything. Think again. Because God is telling us in His Word that we, that I, that you owe everyone love. And not, obviously, not the perverted, distorted, selfish, often sex-driven or shallow versions of love that we see all around us or we often fall victim to ourselves. No, but the pure, holy form of self-giving, agape love that Paul started this whole section with back in chapter 12. Love is the what? The foundation. See, the law could not make someone love. Only love incarnate, or God Himself, Jesus, can change someone to live this way. That's what it means when Paul writes that love is fulfilling the law. See, love is not so much something you do, but someone that you now are. Love is the fullness of what it means to live in God's new creation, character. It is the way of displaying true righteousness, holiness, and the righteousness of God. Folks, the way of love, agape love, pure, holy, unselfish love, is a love that desires the best, God's best, and therefore the ultimate good for everyone that we come into contact with. That means our friends, our family, our church community, the community at large we live in. But then Jesus expands it, remember, to your enemies, and then Paul extended it in the earlier part of this chapter to even those in governing authority. And so look what it says next in verse 10. Paul says, love never hurts a neighbor. Love does not commit evil against a neighbor. So loving is obeying all the law. Again, giving us all pause to think. May that be the way that we live towards one another and then to this world. Love does no evil toward anyone, only good. Period. That is the life of a follower of Jesus. That is the debt that we continually owe to one another and then to this world. No evil, only good. So to help us out, Paul gives us several examples of what bringing harm to people looks like from verses 9 to 13. We just read a few. And we could also go back and retrace what we've covered the last several weeks as examples as well. And again, these are not meant to be an exhaustive list. They're just examples. And I'm sure Paul has in mind how Jesus expanded on all of these from the Sermon on the Mount. But let's just highlight a few of them if we can. See, rather than lusting for another person's spouse or someone at work or someone at school or someone via pornography, rather than living with an adulterous heart, we are to have a heart of pure love. A heart of love that places the beauty of sex and sexual expression back within the plane of God's design, within the covenant of marriage. See, a heart of love protects not only your own moral purity, but the moral purity of others, and does not take advantage of anyone. That's one of the things Paul is trying to say here. That is the debt of love we owe. Or what about murder? Now, most of us are probably thinking, well, I've never killed anybody, right? And you're thinking, well, I haven't done anything like that, so I'm good, right? But remember, Jesus said that hating someone, desiring ill toward them, speaking hatefully with evil and demeaning things about them or toward them is the same as murder. Therefore, a heart of love speaks uplifting, kind, encouraging words that build people up and do not tear people down. Words that bring life, not death. That is the debt of love that we owe people. Or how about stealing or being jealous or coveting what others have, or drunkenness, which is just really a form of irresponsibility, or we're always looking for a fight with either your words or your actions. Again, all these things are things that Paul lists from verses 9 to 13. Those things bring harm or evil upon others. And a heart of love does not and cannot act in those ways toward people. And again, those are just a couple of examples. But love brings life, not death. Help, not harm. kindness and honor, not meanness and scorn. Folks, I owe you love. You owe me love. We all owe this world love. That is our debt as God's new creation people to this world. That is the what. That is the foundation of our lives as followers of Jesus. And here then is where Paul goes from the what to the why. So look here in verse 11. He writes, "Do this because we live in an important time. It is now time for you to wake up from your sleep, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is almost finished, and the day is almost here." This is the why. We live this way. We owe this debt of love because, point number 2, it is now daytime, and it is time to live as the light of God's new creation breaking into the darkness of a broken world. See, the world and all of creation had been in a state of darkness, utter darkness, kind of an endless night, you could say, ever since Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve rebelled against God. And the actions of the human race ever since that day have reflected that. Harm, evil, hatred, a lack of love both towards God and toward other people ever since. But what Paul is telling us is that this is no more. It no longer has to be this way. The endless night is over. See, when Jesus, God in the flesh, came down to this earth, the change from night to day had begun. And as Jesus went to the cross and then 3 days later rose again, you could say at this point that it became the dawn of a brand new day. Light began to pierce the darkness. And like physical days in our physical world, the sun comes up and then it reaches the highest point in the sky when the day has fully come and the sun has its greatest amount of impact. That's what Paul is referring to here when he says the night is almost finished and the day is almost here. See, he is pointing toward the day when Christ returns and sets all things right and makes all things new and judges and removes the very presence of sin from this world. And he brings about new creation, filling the entire world with God's light and his presence, removing all darkness. Which goes back to why this is such an important time now. See, first, Paul is reminding us that this time is limited. See, there are not many hours between the beginning of a sunrise and when the sun is at its peak, when the day is fully here. And regardless of how long it's been since the breaking of that dawn, or how long it will be in God's timing for the coming of the fullness of that day, in between the time Jesus came, he went to the cross, was resurrected, and the time he returns. Regardless of that, either way, each minute that goes, to use Paul's words, each minute that goes by, our salvation is nearer now. The completion of our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. Jesus could come back today. Jesus could come back right in the middle of this teaching. That would be really cool because the video would be running and then I'd be gone. No, that'd be way cool. But anyway, Jesus could come back years from now. It could be decades from now. But Paul's point was never to speculate on the when, but always to emphasize how we are to be living until that day comes. I don't worry about the when. We just need to worry about the how do we live it out now. For us to understand that the daylight is here, we're living in the daylight now, but the time is short. And on that day, we will not have time to be a light in the darkness, because darkness will not exist. That can only happen now in this time in between, which is why this is such an important time. And yet Paul says, in spite of the light breaking through, people are still sleeping. They're ignoring the changes that are already underway. People are still living in darkness or under an old way to live. And Paul is pleading, he is just challenging, he is saying here that it is time to wake up, to realize that it's no longer darkness time, it is time for the light. It is time to wake up, get dressed, and live differently. Do not live like you are still sleeping. Do not live like you're still living in the dark, trying to find your way, or living in the character of darkness. That needs to stop. Your life now needs to reflect the character of God's creation. The light of His presence, the light of His love. And as we do so, in the hopes that it will begin to wake other people up, to wake them from their slumber. This is the only time we have to do that. Which then takes us to our last point, number 3, the how. Clothe yourself with the character of Jesus. How do we pull off the what? The debt of love. How do we pull off the why? We've got this limited amount of time. We clothe ourselves with the character of Jesus. See, when you wake up in the morning, you usually do not spend the whole day in your pajamas. Well, although the last several weeks it's gotten pretty easy to do that. I mean, how many besides me over the last 2 months, and be honest, have worked at least half your day in the same clothes you slept in? Or put on the same sweats or the same comfy clothes you had for more than one day, all right? Yeah. How many of you went a couple days without showering? I won't go there. So anyway, but I bet a lot of us have been down that road. But under normal circumstances, and that's what we're talking about here. Under normal circumstances, you wake up, you have your coffee, you shower, and you get dressed for the day. You take off the clothes that you were wearing that were part of sleeping, of living, quote unquote, in darkness, and you put on new clothes. Clothes that are part of being awake, of living in the light. Now, Paul says in verse 12 that we should stop doing things that belong to the darkness and put on the armor of light. We see similar language then over in Ephesians chapter 6 and elsewhere. But the point is this, that our lives are supposed to look different once we wake up. Once we're no longer snoring, once we're no longer in those positions, once the Son of God's Spirit enters our hearts, we are supposed to look different. And because we still live in this time in between, every day it is a choice. And the choice is this: as you wake up in the morning, which set of clothing are you going to wear today? Your clothes of the night or your clothes of the day? Let me be more specific. Your attitudes and behaviors and lifestyle of the night of darkness of our old sinful, corrupt nature, or your attitudes and behaviors and lifestyle of the day of the light of Christ in our lives, the light of love. See, Paul then wraps this up with an exclamation point just to make sure he was clear. I like how he does that. In verse 14, look here. He says, but clothe yourselves. Okay, that's a pretty clear image. Clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ and forget about satisfying your sinful self. See, literally making the choice to put on the character of Christ as our clothing inside and out. Now, many of you may be asking a very simple question. Well, how do I do this? You know, the simplest way for me to describe this is simply to yield, to choose every day to yield to God's Spirit in you. To pray that the character of Jesus will fill you, that you would yield to His Spirit in and throughout the day and not your old corrupt sinful nature. Putting on new clothes and living a new way. Because that is the sign that you actually are part of this new world that Christ is bringing to pass. See, folks, can I tell you, people will not know that they need Jesus unless they see the love of Jesus in your life and mine. Until they see His light, His transforming power in us. So put on, clothe yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ. And here's the deal. As Paul said, this day, this time, it's important. We need to make the most of these opportunities. These are important times, people. But the good news is this, and here's the summary for today. The love of Christ in our lives can never get depleted. Therefore, showing love to others is simply like paying a debt that can never be paid off. I owe you. You owe me. We owe this world love. Because the love of Christ never runs dry. Folks, have a great Memorial weekend, and we'll see you again next week. God bless.